In our time together last week, we looked at Hebrews chapter 3, and in doing so, we saw that the writer had exhorted the people he was writing to keep persevering to the end, to not lose faith and trust in God, but to keep going. And the advice that he gives them at that point is to not harden their hearts, but instead to listen to God's voice, to hear it, and be ready to respond to it in obedience. And it's a fairly big issue that the writer is wanting to address. He's obviously aware that there's a potential for this to happen. He's obviously seen it before, perhaps aware of it happening within churches, that you see people that would count themselves as part of that group until problems or troubles or temptations arise and they fall away from the living God. They fall away from the one whom their trust is in. And the writer doesn't want them to do this, and so he says, don't harden your hearts when you hear God's voice. But he then gives some advice to individuals and advice to the church collectively. I'm going to think about that over the next few weeks, thinking about how it is, first of all, this week, we as individuals can not fall into that trap, but also how next week we'll be thinking about how we can be encouraging others and also be encouraged by others to keep going and persevering in our faith. So let's get to this section this week where we read in verse 12 of chapter 3 of Hebrews. The writer says this: "Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God." The writer is obviously eager to prevent God's people falling away. He encourages them to watch out, to be aware of the risk. Now, the writer is not exhorting here people to have blind faith, to keep trusting when everything else is rubbish and you have no reason to. He's not encouraging them to be gullible and just believe anything. But instead, what the writer is doing here is drawing the people's attention to the possibility that when struggles come, if they are not careful, then their hearts can easily fall away after doubting the living God. A few years back, we were on holiday as a family at a theme park, and we were coming out one of the rides, and we walked past a waxwork pirate. And my sister's fiance pushed the waxwork against the wall. It got in the way, pushed it against the wall, and he watched his waxwork tip back and lean up against the wall, and then he carried on walking ahead, only for the waxwork to spring into life, scaring the life out of him and all of us as a group too. It became quite entertaining just watching the same thing happen to people after us as well. What we'd done is walk past thinking this living person was dead, that because he wasn't moving or seemingly lifeless, that he wasn't there. I think the writer is wanting us to not fall into that trap in regards to God. When we are facing situations of difficulty, the writer doesn't want us to think that God is not there, like the people of God were doing at the time. Back in the Exodus, as they come out of Egypt, this is what God's people were saying: God's forgotten us. Where is he? What's he doing? He must not be there. He must be a mistake. We should go back to Egypt and go back to the way things used to be. They begin to doubt his seeming absence and his seeming lack of activity as proof or certainty or reason to walk away and fall away from him. I think that's why the writer at the end of verse 12 phrases and refers to God, says the living God. The writer doesn't want us to walk away doubting and disbelieving this God who is very much the living creator, God who sustains us and has saved us. So how can we do this? How can we prevent this from happening? Well, the appeal for us as individuals this week is to take care. It begins, take care. Or other versions, watch out, pay attention, don't fall asleep at the wheel. Instead, we're told to eagerly confront the characteristics of unbelief that we might see in our hearts, lest we fall away. So how do we know what to look for? Well, I think we can gain some insight into what this might be like and some ways we can do this by looking back to the people of Israel at the time of their exodus out of Egypt and what happens. This event is referred to in Psalm 95 when God's people are out in the wilderness. And we read actually in verse 17 of chapter 3, it describes their actions and says the reason they didn't enter into the promised land or the promised rest was because of unbelief. Now, if you know the story well enough, you'll know that likely their unbelief wasn't expressed in verbal ways all the time. It wasn't always expressed, we don't believe God, but often it was reflected and seen in their behaviour and the choices that they made. We can see that instead of exhibiting their unbelief through their words, sometimes it was questioning God's motives and faithfulness. Other times they were constantly complaining about the situations they were in. Other times they were arguing with other people and their fellow brothers and sisters about status and power and possessions and relationships. Other times it was simply looking for the negative in everything, constantly complaining. So let's just think about this in our own lives now for a few moments, that we might pay attention and be able to notice these things in our own life. Now, when it comes to questioning God's plans and faithfulness in our own lives, we often don't diagnose it necessarily straight away as this, but it will more likely be seen in ways such as when we face a situation that we aren't expecting for our lives or hadn't planned, something that we didn't envision occurring in our lives, that we come to God with a frame of mind that He's dropped the ball. Where are you? What are you doing? Haven't you read the game plan? This isn't how it should go. This is not how it's supposed to be. This isn't what I signed up for or what the preacher told me was going to happen. And in doing so, when feeling like this for so long, we lose faith in the fact that God is in control and working everything for our good. For we think if He's in control, then He wouldn't have put us in this situation. We wouldn't be where we are now. He must be not interested in us. Things would be different if He was. And we can therefore be tempted to say, fine, I'll go my own way then. Now this can develop perhaps in other ways of complaining. In a situation like this, we can begin to complain about our situation, moaning about everything that is happening, explaining to anyone that will listen to us how things shouldn't be this way, that we've been overlooked, forgotten, and how things would be different if we were in control. Now, we might not vocalise it this way, but we perhaps do internally. We think it this way, explaining to ourselves that if things were different, if God was really there, then it would be different like this. It wouldn't be like this. Explaining how unfair it is, how unfair God's being to us, how if we were in charge, things would be better or different. And in doing so, we proclaim or act out or feel and come to the conclusion that we don't trust God. We don't believe that He's good. We don't believe His word. We don't believe things are working as they should be. He's robbing us and giving perhaps what we want to somebody else. And that's what people were doing at the time. Claiming life was so much better before back in Egypt. Claiming about what they did or didn't have. And as a result, similarly to us, but just like them, arguments and bitterness towards other people who had those things started to appear. An attitude stemming from a mindset that says if God isn't going to give me what I want, if He's not going to fight for us, I'll have to fight for myself. I'll do it my own way. I won't love my neighbours. I won't love my enemies. Instead, I'll fight for what I want because otherwise I'm not going to get it, because God won't get it for me and God won't be working this for my good. We examine and exhibit unbelief in some of these ways. We'll put everything in order thinking that He's not going to, or at least we'll try to. And even when good things do happen, like God's people, we find reason to find the negative in it. God's people at the time were complaining they were hungry. God provides food from them. They then complain that it doesn't taste, it tastes too bland, or it's too boring, or it's the same thing every day. And so often when we are enjoying something, we still come to the conclusion that it isn't what we wanted it to be, and so we find the negative in it. And we do this in a church life, we do it in our private life, we do it in our relationships, we do it in our work situations. We find reasons and ways to exhibit the fact that we don't think that God is wholly in control, and if He is, it's not a good thing for us. The writer of Hebrews wants us to take care lest we fall into this trap. How do we take care? Well, we listen to ourselves. We search our hearts, we examine it. And we begin to ask why we think the way we think and why we're acting the way we're acting, whether we really are believing that God is in control and working for our good, not just when things are going well, but when things are going badly too. We read the narrative, might be another good way of reading the narrative of God's people in Exodus and Deuteronomy, and ask ourselves, compare ourselves with them. How much alike are we with them? How similar are our statements and our wordings and our expressions to theirs in the times of difficulty? And then deal with it, lest we fall away. Church, we must be careful not to fall asleep at the wheel of our Christian lives, coasting into certain danger, but instead we must take care, watch out, be alert, lest an evil, unbelieving heart leads us to fall away from the living God. So, church, let's take care to keep trusting in God, and I think we can echo the prayer we looked at a few weeks ago in Mark's Gospel, when we say, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief.